and thank you for coming out on this beautiful fall evening to attend a talk sponsored by the Alchemist Society in Vancouver. My name is Ralph Stanton. I'm the chair of the society, and I want to give you a couple of notes about the Alchemist Society. Formed in 1965 in Vancouver, it's the only society in Canada devoted to all aspects of the book, publishing, printing, typography, bookbinding, paper, calligraphy, and all those other bookish things. Book selling, for example, reading, even writing. But mostly the physical book is a subject. Societies like this only really thrive and survive because they have members. And if you have the inclination, I invite you to look us up on the internet and join our society. There are members all across Canada. We have online events, and we have in-person events. And sometimes we sponsor events where printers, publishers, Mindfest people come together, and we have a day of really fun stuff with books. So please look us up and please consider joining. Now, tonight we have somebody to introduce our speaker, Leah Mallon. I'm going to ask her to come here and speak into this microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you. Thanks for having me. So I'm Leah Mallon. I'm a local film, television, and digital producer of content. And years ago, I had the pleasure of first discovering a series of children's books that was co-authored by Robin Mitchell Cranfield. We were now referred to as Windy and Friends, but it was a series of 4 books that I fell in love with. And then I had the pleasure and privilege to work with Robin over the course of probably 3 or 4 years to adapt those books to digital apps that we expanded on the stories, and we made 10 digital apps for preschool children that not just adapted the books, but also delved into other areas of creative play. And what I loved working with Robin was just her amazing attention to design detail and her incredible aesthetic, but also really learned a lot from her passion about teaching children creative problem solving through play and through creative decision making. And the apps went on to win international awards and were lauded and are still out there in the world. So it's just a real pleasure that I get to introduce her tonight. So tonight I'd like to introduce the illustrator, designer, and author, Robin Mitchell Cranfield.
I found a tiny glass of water that I'm going to eat in there. And I'm not sure. Let's see how confident. Okay. I feel like there's a lot of stimulation going on. And today is about bombardment, so maybe that's appropriate. We did test this. It's just like teaching, yeah. All right. So I'm Robin. Leah, who just introduced me, is very modest, and she didn't say that she's an amazing film producer, and one of her works that projects that she worked on was Postmodern, which I love, and I love their poster and everything about it. So thank you all for coming. I was completely prepared to present to 5 people, for real. I realized this is the first talk that I've done where my promotion technique wasn't to tack a poster under a bridge at midnight and then tell people to go find that poster if they want to come. So thank you. I really appreciate you coming out here on a Wednesday night in the fall. So thank you, Leah, and thank you for coming out tonight. Leah is not only someone that I worked with on a project for children, but she's involved in public design education and working to keep local institutions like the Cinematheque available to us. So I'm really pleased she could come out tonight. I'd also like to thank Gina Page, and of course Rob, and Natalie Davidovich, who can't be here tonight, and everyone at the Alcuin for hosting and organizing this event, the Alcuin work really hard to support fine book printing and design here in Vancouver. So, I am Robin Mitchell Cranfield. I recognize many of you, but for those of you who don't know me, I am an illustrator and a book designer, and I teach design at Emily Carr University. I'm also interested in public education about design for all ages. This is a workshop that you see here on tree branching for third-year design students in a class on pattern and color literacy last year, and this was part of my investigation into Bruno Minari's work. The last book I made was about observing patterns in nature for children. Right on the dust jacket, I have Enzo Mari listed as an inspiration because that book was very much inspired by her. And the last two talks I've given for the Alcuin have been about typographic culture. This evening's talk is a counterpoint to typographic observation and expression. It's about typeless, wordless books, also called silent books, which communicate mainly through image, but also through form. The first thing I ever wrote for the Alcuin was an essay about what the form of the book in the 21st century might look like. And honestly, mostly it was just telling people that the book's not dead and it's gonna be fun. I borrowed a concept from designer Kenya Hara, who wrote in the early aughts that as paper books lose their place as the default medium for communication, their use becomes a choice, and therefore the book becomes free to be enjoyed as its own charming self and appreciated for its tangibility and tactility. I think that was prescient, and as it happens, there is a wave of interest in paper publishing, materiality of books by young designers going on now. The posters for this exhibit are made in the Riso lab at Emily Carr, where students work with older technology. Riso is a sort of combination of photocopying and silk screening. Everyone working in that lab are shaped by the choices and processes of studio technician Kathleen Jacques. For example, I completely deviated on the branding for this talk when I found out Kathleen was bringing in lime green ink last month. So I started off with the red, it was all consistent red, and then we got this lime green ink, and so we made some big apple posters that you're welcome to take home. And actually, Ralph, do you mind holding that up? So please take one on your way out. There should be enough for everybody. And just bear in mind, each one is separated by old sheets that have gone, essentially make-readies that have gone through the press, so don't be confused and take one of those to protect the ink. Okay. And of course, there are faculty who are involved in working with students and making this work. John Hannon and Catherine Gillison, and other people who make this a living place. So this is the Jamaica Bar in Milan. It's a storied place. Iela Mari frequented it along with many artists of her era. One reason I've begun to look at mid-century Italian publishing history is its long-standing legacy of excellence in printing. But another is that Italy has kept major regional dialects alongside its national languages modernization. That ability seems to me to be really relevant information as we're looking for ways to maintain and revitalize languages and dialects all over the world while finding common languages to communicate in. Another reason is that Italian design is gorgeous and fun to look at. And of course, informing that is excellent Italian cultural criticism that engages with the book and other media, but the book as a designed object that is infused with expressive potential. It's my feeling that Italy's contribution of design literacy is simultaneously internationally celebrated and underappreciated. And this reflects a larger problem in design culture, which is that most people relate to design through consumption and not process, without necessarily understanding that process or understanding it as a palette to be engaged with seriously. One of the great champions of design as art is Bruno Minari. Bruno Minari was a prolific artist, designer, and writer. Minari's first book for children was in 1945, and he's the foundation in many ways for the cultural moment I'm discussing this evening. Last year I gave a talk on Minari's strategy of using clay to teach, and that was part of Italian Design Weeks with the Italian Chamber of Commerce. I compared his creative style to a river because it is swift, consistent, and efficient. And he was also obsessed with currents, not the food, currents of electricity, for example. Here he is demonstrating air currents at a public workshop. The focus of my last talk was Minari's strategy of employing play as a teaching tool and his use of publishing as a means of public art education. It just looks so cool there. Okay. And the books of poetry he produced throughout his life were also often wordless. Minari's development of the book as a total object, as an expressive form, and testing the limits of that form, whether in a tin book on the left, or a bed book, is foundational to what I'm sharing this evening. An example of some of his more expressive publication design from the mid-century is Nalanote Buya, shown here, which plays with form and special papers. Here, holes in the black pages let you see through to yellow paper that's stuck to the interior back cover, like from stuck to the end papers. The book was originally proposed as a wordless project, and it mostly is wordless, but it was originally proposed as a wordless project. And this caused publishers to reject it, like Valentino Bompiani, who said, "But this is not a book, where is the text?" And this reflected an understanding at the time that a book without words was a problem, and not, as Giulia Mirandola wrote, rich with significance. Marni Campagnaro of the University of Padova describes Minari's ability to think creatively with production techniques as a poetics of paper and ink. So part of Minari's creative process was to think about the expressive potential of printing, including what materials and expertises and production networks he could work with, to make his concept publishable and affordable. Related to this is his relationship with the many skilled printers and small book imprints in and around Milan and in northern Italy. So people like Kathleen Jacques in the Risolat, that's what we're looking for, is people who you can partner with creatively in production. So when we look at all this great design, it's good to not lose sight of the well-nourished networks that supported its development. For example, editor and printer Giuseppe Magini was an important part of realizing the production of Nalanote Buya, and I gather from speaking with Korayani, who still publishes today, that it's still a challenge to find the right set of skills to do it. Minari's Pre-Libri series, which he made for Danese, takes wordlessness and tactility to a new level. These books are made to be read in any direction. You can read them back to front if you want, or upside down. And they're able to offer that flexibility by being wordless. Pre-Libri uses all kinds of material, wood or plastic. This emphasizes their tactility and they double as toys. With Minari, there is much to choose from. So many projects, books he's written, even a recorded lecture. There are podcasts about him, lots of profiles. And the mythology about who he was is a story that he himself helped to create. He's a designer after all, right? He's in communications. This made researching him more of a question of editing than anything else. Enzo Mari is a different matter. Enzo Mari, born Gabriella Ferrario, is harder to learn about. This is how the curators of Iela's 2010 retrospective exhibit, who are Giordana Piccini and Ilaria Tontardini, described tracking her down. They said, "For years, we didn't hear anything of her. We often asked ourselves where she wound up, what she was doing, a bit like Salinger." The Hamelin curators explained that in researching her, they also couldn't find interviews with her, essays, bibliographies, or anything, quote, save for a brief biography, a solo photo that circulated around the web, a young woman captured almost involuntarily at a 3/4 angle, end quote. And it sounds as if it was almost by chance that a librarian told the curators that Enzo Mari was living in absolute solitude in Milan, and they were able to then track her down by phone. And they have quite a charming story about her, and she was like quite a chain smoker. So anyway, in 2017, Iela's son, Michele Mari, released a semi-autobiographical work of autofiction called Legenda Privata, and that provides new information and photographic information about her as well. He described her as former scout, former mountain climber, enormously precocious graphic illustrative talent. He also has a really wonderful essay about her called Jigsawed Greens, about her love of puzzles. According to this essay, she and he both would put together enormous and difficult jigsaw puzzles. And as soon as they were done the jigsaw puzzle, the rule was you weren't supposed to let other people see it and admire it. That was kind of against the rules. You had to immediately pull it apart. So she thought like if you glued it together, for example, that was like a sin. And not left out for others to see and admire, which is kind of an interesting parallel to the way that she's kind of quite secret and not that well known. Most of the information that I share today comes from the Hamelin catalog that I mentioned. I think Hamelin are heroes, and I'm grateful that they were able to reach her, work through her archive with her, interview her, and put on a retrospective of her work before she passed away in 2014. Iela Mari produced 9 works, each are made with care. Of all the descriptions that I've read of her, Fabian Negron's description of her as a jeweler was my favorite because it captures how rare and special her work is. I have most of these at the back. The one that I don't have is Once Upon a Time. There was a sea urchin, which is here, and I also don't have this Il Paesaggio Infinito. I can't actually find a physical copy of that I can afford, but the rest are at the back if you want to take a look. So, 1967 to 1972. As Loredana Farina explains in her essay from the Hamelin catalog, 1967 was an annus mirabilis for children's publishing in Italy. This was the year that Bologna Ragazzi Book Fair held its first exhibition. 1972 is the year a dedicated children's bookshop, La Libreria dei Ragazzi, opened. These events mark a period in which children's literature went from being an item stocked in stationery shops, like barely considered books, to a growing and vibrant sector of publishing. This era is famous for its social reform and student activism. We think of the Paris riots or the terrible situation at Kent State. This era also marks the beginning of Indigenous language curriculum in Canadian schools, and in-class publishing was one strategy that Indigenous language educators used to grow this movement, along with a land-based curriculum. And these interventions are paralleled in rural Italian classrooms of the era. Since the 1950s, a rebellion against commercialization, rigid social hierarchies, and centrally planned design had been brewing internationally, and that voice found expression in Italy through the radical design movement. Avant-garde designers in Italy looked for ways to undermine the established canon of work that had been so internationally popular and commercially successful, and they started exploring pop, eclecticism, and irony, and producing expressive work. This dream bed from Arkasum is an iconic piece of radical design from 1967, with that enormous sculptural A coming to life right in the room with you. In 1972, this movement was featured at the Museum of Metropolitan Art in the landmark exhibition, Italy, the New Domestic Landscape, which closed exactly 52 years ago today. This featured a huge array of Italian design talent grappling with issues of the day. The heady boom economic times of the economic miracle of the 1960s in Italy gave way to years of economic stagnation in the 70s, which impacted the publishing sector, of course, and there was increasingly political turmoil and violence. The new domestic landscape was also very critical on the impact of commercial design on the environment, and they shared this concern with designers around the world. Stuart Brand's 1968 Whole Earth catalog became an emblem in America of a movement that Stanford professor Fred Turner has termed digital utopianism. The idea that digital technology might liberate us, and that's going great. Relatedly, this is the beginning screen of like our screen life as we know it, the early times of the screen life as we know it. Steve Jobs was leaving behind his job picking apples on a commune to found Apple, and color televisions began outselling black and white ones. And related to that, US advertisers in 1970 spent almost $75 million on children's entertainment advertisements, and that was just on weekends. So in this radical educational environment, children were often developing visual and media literacy skills through advertisements. Enzo Mari, right? So Milanese architect and design educator Stefano Boeri, who also edited Domus, describes designer Enzo Mari as a constellation because he, quote, created an amazing array of works from paper, wood, pottery, iron, steel, moving between the spheres of art, design, and architecture, graphic design, and these works are now in collections everywhere in the world, end quote. Mari falls into an interesting category, which is someone who thundered against beautiful objects, who also made beautiful objects. And he really did make beautiful objects. This talk isn't about that, but just Google Enzo Mari and enjoy yourself. MoMA curator Paola Antonelli, who grew up in Milan in the 1970s, has spoken affectionately about both the cement panettone of Milan, that you can see here, and his 1957 16 animali puzzle, also for Danese. She couldn't remember what the first work that she encountered was growing up in the 70s in Milan. These were her guesses. In 1957, Enzo Mari collaborated with his wife Iela for Bompiani. So if you remember, Bompiani was the one who was skeptical about wordless books a couple of years prior to this. Anyway, Bompiani published The Apple and the Butterfly in 1959. And unlike 16 Animali, 16 Animals, which was like a huge bestseller, this was not. It didn't sell well, partly because it was small. It got drowned out by the larger, more luxurious children's books around it. Iela and Enzo Mari's second book, The Chicken and the Egg, was created shortly after The Apple and the Butterfly in 1960, but it wasn't released until 1969. I haven't verified this, but my guess is that the success of The Red Balloon of 1967 that we're going to talk about set the stage for that, but I could be wrong. So both of these books that we just saw, they were inspired by the birth of their first child, Michele. Stefano Boeri uses the physical items designed by Enzo Mari as only one dimension of his archive. The other is, quote, a sequence of monologues of indignation and rage. And actually, I listened to one of these once, and he's not kidding. It was very intense. And these monologues were both in public talks and lectures, as well as in private at dinner parties. And perhaps this is why his second wife, Leah, called him a storm. I thought it was interesting that part of his archive is, first of all, kind of not tangible in a way, and also that it's the opposite of silent. It's like yelling, but anyway. So one of Mari's early graphic works were his covers for Adelphi. And Loredana Farina, who pioneered publishing game books, Libri Gioco, so like, kind of like what we looked at, over here, like game books. She pioneered publishing that. She's reported spending hours in the library looking at book covers, all different book covers, and the design of these series was a turning point for her understanding of the potential for publishing design, and she wrote about this. I didn't know about the existence of editorial graphics. The profession that I came to understand is fundamental to that communicative object that is a book. So I thought that was really interesting because it's not that long ago, and so the idea of somebody sort of discovering that at the time was interesting to me. So Farina is describing a rising consciousness of the potential for image and layout to be understood as a language, which might be an underappreciated legacy of the 1960s. That's what I'm alleging. Image reproduction and photography are technologies that weren't new in the 1960s, but artists and writers began to access more easily technologies and processes that they hadn't been to before, just things like a point-and-shoot camera, stuff like that. John Berger developed an analysis and volume of criticizing addressing image-based communication in his landmark 1972 series, Ways of Seeing. And I just need to take a drink of water, please excuse me, I'm gonna disappear. Here I am, it's like a children's show. Okay, so here we are. Berger's purpose was to criticize Western cultural aesthetics, engaging in conversations, for example, about the gaze that subjects or paintings of commercial photo shoots are subject to, women mostly. He also looks at the role that context plays in our reading of historical works. Leading up to this, he was engaging in amateur photography and collaborating with editorial designers like Herbert Spencer of Typographica magazine. It's significant that Berger was influenced by an art director as he was developing his ideas and asking questions like, what would a visual table of contents look like? Berger noted that photographs and poems both form a sequence, and writing about these investigations, he wrote in a 1965 essay, "The possibility of new relations between words and images is seldom pursued on a constructive public scale. No editor yet thinks of a photographic library as a possible vocabulary. Nobody dares to place images as precisely in relation to a text as a quotation would be placed. Few writers yet think of using pictures to make their argument." So he wrote that in 1965. Now, I have not really run this sort of concept. I haven't discussed it too much with people who are in photography and film, but that's something that I'd like to do over the coming year because I'd be curious to know if people in that profession are like, well, yeah, I know what you were thinking of. But the point is he, as a writer, was thinking about it. And in 1967, Berger collaborated on a project called A Fortunate Man, which is a photographic work about a country doctor looking at the potential for this kind of storytelling where the viewer is left to make sense of the images. And I do know that this is something Stanley Kubrick has talked about, that when you're doing a film, it's not like writing, you can't kind of like block off some things. The person who's viewing it is going to make sense of the imagery kind of around you. And so that was the premise of this. Beautiful piece. Berger felt that the tempo of a sequence of still images is slower and more contemplative than that of a film, but they both relate to time passing, and his awareness of these different media informed his work in ways of seeing. As design historian Rick Poynter explains in his History of Typographica magazine, by 1972, Berger was using photographic imagery as vocabulary, quotation, and argument. Berger has a very different approach to Enzo Mari, and how he's engaging with a social critique of art and design. But they are both engaged in a shared conversation about commerce and educational reform. Mario Lodi was a teacher who had been imprisoned during the war for anti-fascist activities, and after his release, he devoted himself to developing a classroom that would teach children democratic principles and a critically engaged attitude towards the lessons they were being given, rather than passively accepting information. He was influenced by an educator in another rural town, Don Lorenzo Milani. When he arrived in Barbiana to meet Father Lorenzo, Lodi found him with his students in the woods. Milani's classroom had very few supplies, single copies of books, and just one big large table that the children would gather around. Older students taught younger pupils as part of their education. Don Lorenzo Milani was radical, and I'm sure he'd make an interesting counterpoint actually to Sister Corita Kent, but I made a note to myself, let's not have a digression. Okay, so he released a classic book called Letter to a Teacher in 1967. The book is written from the perspective of one of his students, beginning, "Dear Miss, you won't even remember my name, but I have thought often of you and your colleagues in that institution called school." And then it just goes on for pages, like your dream letter of writing to your teacher. So the book claims in a preface that the writing is the work of Milani's students, working together with help from parents and teachers. They have synthesized themselves into a single voice. The students question and criticize the way children were treated in their old classrooms and standard classrooms, criticizing the way some of them felt unable to speak or be heard, often dropping out of school, being harshly punished, or simply failing, and developing a negative relationship with books and reading. The production of this book is an example of how a book's bookness can amplify its message because the students are creating an entry into the very canon they are protesting and which they felt excluded by. Mario Lodi also published a book created with students in his classroom as they followed the lives of a sparrow, I think multiple sparrows, and a cat near their school. And I have to be honest, I haven't read this one because I accidentally ordered a Spanish edition, and I only just received a copy I can read like a week ago. Anyway, so this is the classic 1972 book, Cipi, known to many Italians of my age, from what I understand. This book begins with Once Upon a Time, and the narrator's voices are younger, and the overall tone is more of a story than a polemic. But certainly, the idea that children are involved in the telling of a story and that they are actively observing the world around them, especially life cycles and nature, is a theme that's relevant to the reclusive star of this talk, Iela Mari. Neither of these books are silent. They are not even really illustrated, but they place the voices of children into the book. And rather than being talked to, they're being talked with. They're working with as an editorial team. This combination of observation of nature and cooperative narration is central to Iela Mari's work, which is often credited with creating a space for discussion between an adult reader and a child. The child's ability to see the images for themselves rather than relying on the adult to read text, and, as Minari has emphasized, the way that children's capacity to notice little tiny details that escape us and ask questions also facilitates them to take their place as conversational partners. They're not having the book translated to them, they're participating. The space for intergenerational conversation is a key feature of Il Palancino Rosso from 1967. This has been translated as the magic balloon and also the red balloon, which is more accurate. The red balloon has a stripped back simplicity and a highly graphic aesthetic. It seems like a snapshot of an optimistic moment right on the cusp of something new. There is a lightness that I don't associate with the richer, more intense graphic work of the 1970s. And Iela Mari's book, The Tree from 1973, for example, which is absolutely beautiful, has a lusher style, as does Animals in the Meadow from 1978. I'll show this in a bit. The large amounts of negative space in the book reinforce that sense of spaciousness afforded to the reader. And Loredana Farina, the puzzle book person, Loredana Farina describes this space as open air. It is a place of possibility for the reader and a space that is waiting for the reader. Some of the words Farina uses to describe the red balloon are elegant and breathtaking. And as with Iela Mari's other books, Farina describes Iela Mari as presenting information in a style of scientific information that doesn't exclude fantasy. The editor who first published The Red Balloon was Rossellina Arquinto. Rossellina Arquinto is an iconic figure in her own right who published groundbreaking visually driven children's books in Italy throughout her imprint Emme Edizioni. In 1967, Arquinto published an Italian translation of Little Blue and Little Yellow, as well as the first edition of The Red Balloon. This marked a sea change in the 1960s in Italy, where children's literature began to be taken more seriously in both cultural and commercial terms, as I mentioned earlier. She's really cool. I'm still learning about her, and I could easily just start talking about how cool she is, but I'll pull myself back. So Arquinto was especially important for Iela Mari's development as an artist, and Iela Mari describes her as beautiful, just a countess. Someone who is extraordinarily stylish. Arquinto had worked as a stylist, including for Giorgio Armani, when Arquinto saw some cushion designs that Iela Mari had made for the Rinascente department store, and she tapped them for a book, which became Animals in the Meadow. So these are from that original design. It was one big piece of fabric that these are details from, and it was colored. This underscores Iela Mari's role as a designer, as an important part of her art. In a beautiful short essay, her children, Agostina and Michele Mari, recall watching her process, which included tools like lettreset and graph paper, a habit of consulting proofs and creating mock-ups, which she would test with children. They describe her dedication to, quote, the clear, ultra-graphic sign, a graphic language she wound up developing more for books than for shops or magazines. But as her children recall, there were other drawings, scarves, designs that never made it to press because, quote, our mother was a perfectionist. So Arquinto's translation of Leo Leoni that same year marks her work with this other design-trained illustrator.
Leone had worked as the design director at Olivetti and was a successful commercial artist. He'd originally released Little Blue and Little Yellow in 1959, and by the way, if his name sounds familiar to you, he's Frederick the Mouse, also. The following year, from Little Blue and Little Yellow, the original, he released a book called Design for the Printed Page that was made for Fortune magazine. The book used a graphic language self-consciously developed through advertising. And he wrote, "One purpose of this book is to remind advertisers that design is a seemingly inexhaustible source of visual excitement, but also the pages of this book have not been designed as mere eye catchers for just any block of advertising copy. They are intended to indicate instead the immense variety and pliability of the language of design and the power of the printed page to evoke a multitude of moods." Designer and illustrator Andrea Rauch connects the visually expressive language that Leone was demonstrating here, especially the alliteration between forms, with the advertising language that had helped to facilitate or fertilize the visual landscape that Enzo Mari was working in. He connects this Barilla advertisement from Roberto Carbone to the precise visual language used in Iela and Enzo Mari's book, The Chicken and the Egg, for example. Now that we've gone over Mari's ultra-graphic precision, I want to loop back to the point Berger was looking at between 1965 and 67, that the tempo of a sequence of still images is slower and more contemplative than that of a film, but they both relate to time passing. A common observation people make about Iela Mari's work is that the pages seem like film or animation stills, with the action taking place in front of a fixed camera. And so it's easy to imagine the sequences in a film. As it happens, MA Edizioni actually released an edition of The Chicken and the Egg, The Tree and the Red Balloon on boxed film strips that speaks to this relationship. I'm still working out exactly what the history of this is, but it's so beautiful. I'm just gonna slip in like a tiny little bit of CanCon in here, because the animator that Giusy Korengi, another one of the Hamelin essayists, compares Iela Mari to is Norman McLaren and his 1968 Pas de Deux. Korengi quotes Mari in 1988, addressing the context in which she was working. She said, "I would like to draw the viewer's attention to form in relation to television's bombardment of images." I like Korengi's perspective that Iela Mari's work isn't reactive, which is one of the things that she says. She explains that it's not Disney, but it's not anti-Disney, it just simply is, unfolding through the turn of each page on its own terms. It asks for focus, but it's quiet. It offers a break from the bombardment rather than offering a counter-bombardment. The last part of the story today belongs to Katsumi Komagata. Komagata is a book artist who, like Minari and Iela Mari and Enzo Mari, was a working designer. Komagata is a wordless book artist who is especially concerned with form and possibilities and properties of paper, which is a different approach to Iela Mari's focus on graphic clarity. And you can see here the one strip that he founded also functions as a gallery at times, so children are playing there. Komagata began working with children's books in the early 1990s. His projects are designed to encourage tactile, interactive play. The books that I brought here tonight at the back are from his Little Eyes series. These are books that become more complex over time. So this is for 3 months, and then this is for a few months later when you're starting to introduce colors. So they're books that become more complex over a series for a very young child whose gaze is developing. And so one of the things that he has in common with Iela Mari in terms of what people say about them is that they're helping to train children's gaze. Like, how do we look at something? And this connects to the prelude, is also the idea of teaching children to enjoy books and associating them with a good time, and not something that you're supposed to read when you're looking at your phone. One interesting difference between Komagata's books for young children and Minari's Prelude
is that the prelibri are made with more durable materials than paper to stand up to rougher play. But Komagata sticks to paper, explaining that opportunities to mend the book as a project becomes part of knowing it. When Komagata took on the job of designing a space for Iela Mari's exhibit for the Itabashi Art Museum in Tokyo, he was able to have a wordless conversation with Iela's work through his design of the space. He translated each of her small books into room-sized installations with panels hung from the ceiling. Each section of the gallery was organized around a single book, with tables to read at, but also large cubes that can be rotated, stacked, or rearranged, and folding screens presented like enormous accordion fold books. Many of the items are wood, which was selected for its warmth, and one of the loveliest details of the exhibition is that there are large windows through which trees can be observed. A child's gaze can move from observing the book page or sequence to the interior space to the natural space outside. None of these are bombardments. There's no character or story leading you around the space. They're just interesting and varied spaces to observe and explore. Like Iela Mari and Bruno Minari, Komagata is someone whose books are understood as poetry, and he works between an art and publishing practice. This is a catalog for the Mari exhibition. One special detail that you can see if you go back there is that the flaps on the dust jacket, they're semicircles. So cool. He connected most to Iela Mari's simplicity of form and especially her use of the circle. So there's a really nice visual conversation going on between them there that you can see. Along with Enzo Mari, these are key artists who helped develop wordless books for children as artist books. Iela Mari passed away in 2014, and sadly, Enzo Mari was one of the casualties of Milan's ordeal with COVID. He passed away in 2020. Katsumi Komagata also passed away just this spring. And the concept that each of these artists dedicated to themselves were art editions that are made accessible through production. In order to maintain that legacy, they need publishers to act as curators, which we should support, right? Bruno Minari and Enzo Mari, I've been really lazing out other names. Bruno Minari and Enzo Mari, let me try my best. Editions remain in print through Koraini Edizioni, and Iela Mari's works remain in print through Baba Libri. Komagata founded his own publishing house, One Stroke, in Tokyo in 1990, and that's still going too. So these editions are still here to educate and inspire us. If somebody comes up to me, I didn't put it at the back, but this isn't a wordless book, so it doesn't really fit in the exhibition, but this beautiful book by Komagata that it shows the unfolding of a tree over time. Every spread shows the tree growing, and then it dies, and then it comes back again. So come find me, and I'll show you. We can freak out about it. Okay, I want to end with a brief note about Iela and Enzo Mari's son, Michele Mari, who has written about his family and childhood as autofiction, which I have to say makes it kind of tricky. I can't always tell if I'm reading something where he's making things exaggerated and referencing foreheads or something. I'm not always sure. But he has written about his family and childhood as autofiction, and he did that most recently in a 2017 book called Legenda Privata. A translated edition of his book, You Bleeding Childhood, was just released in 2023. So there's an English edition of his work available now. So, like many people, my relationship with his parents is that they are icons to me. Michele has found a way to write about his parents as artists and as flawed and complex people. And one of his themes is his relationship with books. And it's a reminder of what books provide for children, private worlds to retreat from, a sometimes overwhelming place, and a place to build private worlds for yourself. In an essay addressing his son Filippo about his own childhood comics and books, he writes, "They are the flower of my childhood, you see, and they are, therefore, my essence." Oh, Robin. All right. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. These are places you can find the books we talked about today. Please support these publishers. I also have a podcast that I update like once a year, but I do update it. I also have a podcast, and I do have a series about Iela Mari there if you're interested. So thank you very much. Do you have any questions? Come on, Vancouver, I know you have one question. It's fine if you don't, you can come speak to me quietly, silently.
I'll ask.
Okay.
When did you first discover her?
Iela Mari? That's a really good question because I'm not sure, but when I started to look at her more seriously, I realized I do tons of things that are informed by her. And I think a lot of it was just unconscious. And there's an interview with a couple of contemporary illustrators, I'm forgetting their names, but one's Swiss and one is French, and they kind of said the same thing. Like they can now see kind of cyclical and that kind of camera fixed. So she just seeped into our quietly. She got around. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Leah. Any other questions?
Do you know more about the process? Because it seems like some of the new books that digitally done, while illustrations originally were possibly painted.
Yeah, I don't think she did anything digital, and as you're saying, if you look through those catalogs, you can see some of her drafts. And one of the nice things is you can see kind of her rougher drafts that are preserved, which I think as an illustrator is like kind of heartening, like it didn't start off perfect. So I don't think she became switched over to a digital practice, but she did teach in the 80s, so maybe she worked with some people who did. That's a good question. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, then thank you so much.
Robin, thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. Wonderful presentation. And thank you for introducing us to this gang of Italian wonderful people. Also, I want to thank you for bringing back John Berger because in the 1990s he was basically accused of thought crime, and it seems the main crime was thinking clearly, which is something that's increasingly difficult to do. But nevertheless, he is a great British author. It's so important in understanding visual stuff.
He has
Italian heritage? Well, there you go. That explains it. It would really be amiss not to mention Gina Page, our person who is the head of our programs chair. There she is back there. Gina, would you put your hand up? Thank you, Gina. Leah, do you want to come up and say anything? Make a comment?
No, I'll just get in a corner with Robin and we'll talk about it.
Okay, so there's going to be time to engage with each other, hang around, look at these amazing books, chat with Robin Mitchell Cranfield, and I hope to see some of you back at other events. And please take a trip into our website and keep up with what we're doing. Thank you so much.